Good evening, and welcome to Columbia Law School. My name is Michael Gerard. I'm a professor here, and I teach courses on environmental law, energy regulation, and climate change law, and I direct the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, which is co-sponsoring this evening's program with the Sallan Foundation, the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, and the Earth Institute of Columbia University. This event is part of Climate Week. If you are tweeting tonight, which is encouraged, please use the hashtag for Climate Week of New York, which is hashtag CWNYC. And you're also welcome to use the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund's hashtag, which is hashtag silencing science. The job of environmental regulation is largely about taking the findings of science about the sources and impacts of pollution and other human activities and turning it into laws and regulations. So it's not a surprise that the entities that will be regulated sometimes fight back, and they do that in part by attacking the climate science, the underlying science. In the late 2000s, when the science about the risks of climate change was becoming even clearer, and when it looked like the political system in the United States was getting ready to actually pass substantive legislation, and when both the Democratic and Republican candidates for president in 2008, Senator McCain and Senator Obama, wanted to move forward with climate legislation, at that time, climate science denial became even stronger. Since then, the science has become even more compelling, but we have in the United States, the country has elected a climate-denying president and climate-denying majorities in both the House and the Senate, and this sentiment has also overtaken the government of some states, even some of the states that are right now being ravaged by extreme events that are worsened by climate change. Not unrelated, although there is some argument about which is the chicken and which is the egg, we have television networks and radio talk shows and newspaper editorial boards that are devoted to denying climate science and have become megaphones for climate science denial. This evening's program is about fighting back against the attacks on climate science. I'll introduce our keynote speaker, who became one of the most vigorous climate regulators until the results of the 2016 plunged us into this hopefully short-lived period of federal retrogression. Then Nancy Anderson, who is the executive director of the Sallan Foundation, will introduce our moderator, who is a leading environmental journalist, who will in turn introduce our distinguished panel. Please hold your questions. We'll have time toward the end of the program for a Q&A session. It's now my honor to welcome Gina McCarthy back to Columbia Law School as this evening's keynoter. As I think everybody in the room knows, she was the administrator of the U.S. EPA under President Obama from 2013 until January of 2017. She led the development of the Clean Power Plan and many other initiatives to fight climate change and other environmental hazards. Before joining EPA in 2009 as Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation, Ms. McCarthy served 5 Massachusetts Democratic and Republican administrations and was Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection. She's currently Professor of the Practice of Public Health in the Department of Environmental Health at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Director of Harvard's Center for Climate Health and the Global Environment. So please join me in welcoming Gina McCarthy.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Michael. It's great to be back at Columbia. That is where I am. I've been busy. Just checking. I'm just checking in on you. You know where you are. I'm trying to think of how I make this humorous and light conversation to talk about the attack on climate science. It's a tough one, I have to tell you. But I think I should start by telling you, first of all, that we've made an incredible amount of progress in this country. And I'm tired of being angry and frustrated and a bitter old woman, and I refuse to dwell on that, at least tonight. Let's try to be at least kind, which I'm not often these days. But listen, back in 1946, if you go back that far, there was a headline that called the smoke that shrouded Los Angeles a dirty gray blanket flung across the city. Another called it a dense, eye-stinging layer of smoke that dimmed the sun. You know, LA was the preeminent pollution capital of the world, and deservingly so. They had school closed and canceled for smog days. Orange County seemed to get its name not from the sort of fruit that it grew, but from the color of the sky. And so as pollution built, really, people got really ticked off about it. They complained about it. They took action about pollution they could see and feel and taste. That gave birth to Earth Day, right? Remember Earth Day? We still do those. And US EPA was created by absolutely the most wonderful president ever. Yeah, you know, Richard M. Nixon. I was kidding about one of the greatest parts. But the US Congress then passed an incredible amount of laws, and in particular the Clean Air Act of 1970, which really charged EPA to set air quality standards that paved the way for an incredible emergence of new technologies, new products that have made our world cleaner and healthier. We took big leaps forward, folks, because we worked together. We will continue to take big leaps forward no matter who is sitting in the White House. We are a democracy. It is of, by, and for the people. We're the people. It's time for us to speak. But listen. The challenge that we face today is that the EPA, now I know that you know and I know and everybody knows that all the rules that we did that we thought were really cool, that asked for sort of sensible kind of reasonable approaches to both traditional pollutants and climate change, all those are facing rollbacks. Believe me, I know this, I dwell on it, my husband mentions it to me every day. He's trying to be supportive. I'm trying to tell him to shut up in a nice way. Look, these are very difficult times, but I want you to understand one thing, and it's really fundamental to the conversation today, is that we really actually did rules right. We followed what the law said. We spent an exorbitant amount of time understanding the scientific underpinnings of our decisions. We did not overreach. We asked for reasonable, cost-effective approaches moving forward, knowing full well that if we did this right, generally the private sector we regulate continues that momentum moving forward. These are stage-setting opportunities to take advantage of cost-effective reductions available today, but it sets the stage for more and more and more. That's how we regulate in a democracy. We don't make big leaps. We don't figure out in our own little cocoon where we should be 30 years from now and ask people to be there tomorrow. You make reasoned approaches and steps moving forward. You document it. You do horrendous amounts of public research. That happens to be the most fun opportunity of your life if you get a chance to do it. And then you make a step forward and you do a final rule. And you expect the final rule to be final. Because it is horrendous. It's a big lift and it's meant to. Because the federal government has no right to regulate unless we are given authority to do it, unless there's a damn good reason, and unless you have science and facts to back it up. That's how it all works. So I know we did the job we were supposed to do. So no matter what you see or worry about rollbacks, I have tremendous confidence, and I remain a very hopeful human being. I am not walking around like Eeyore the donkey, having lost my tail. My tail's intact. I'm going to hold my head up and we're going to move forward. But I'll tell you, the one thing that concerns me more than anything, and it's the thing that folks who I talk to in the communications arena probably know well, is that underpinning all these visible attacks on rollbacks, which everybody can rally around and get involved in, there is an insidious movement moving forward, which is really about attacking the science and the scientists themselves. That is much more difficult to garner support to rally around. And it could be one of the most damaging outcomes, even if the rollbacks don't succeed. Because it's continuing the mantra that government is not your friend, is not working for you, that it is a political entity solely, that it has vested interests and is moving to those vested interests, which aren't based on science and reality and what humans need to have in order to ensure their basic right to clean air and clean water and clean land. That's what EPA is designed to protect. And these insidious attacks on science are real challenges to the very fabric of why government exists, why a democracy exists. And nothing could be more visible in this attack than the attack on climate. Science on climate is without a doubt the most robust science that we have available to us, and I need to hear no more about climate science. I will not debate it. I frankly won't discuss it. It has more science behind it than the science around tobacco smoke. And if we figured out how to do that, we need to figure out how to move forward on the issues related to climate change. Because science has, and it must always be, the engine that drives prosperity and innovation in the United States of America. We're not just denying climate science, we're denying the economic benefits and the jobs and the leadership internationally that come along with embracing what we know climate science tells us and the actions that we need to take to move increasingly towards a clean energy economy. We are being captured by folks that would rather look backwards than look forwards, rather than the science that has been the mainstay of our public health efforts since day one, since the time that Richard Nixon started the EPA. So we have to wake up, folks, that there is a politicization. I love that word. I only love it when I can say it, which is only 2 out of 10 times, so I'm not going to say it again. It's just amazing that you have a science issue actually being part of party platforms. How can that be? That if I want to be a true Republican, I need to be for it, against it, and if I'm a true Democrat, I need to be for it. When did truth lose out in this equation? When did science really lose its stature as what informs discussions moving forward? Not dictates them, but informs them. EPA never does a rule solely on the basis of science, but it must never do a rule that conflicts with known science. That's how it works. Then the question of what you do about it, what policies you put in place, and how far you go matters. And EPA has been enormously successful when it's armed itself with sound science to steer America away from tremendous health risks and towards a higher quality of life, particularly for the communities that need that boost the most. Don't forget that climate change is nothing more than carbon pollution. We have made it something distant, unreal. We can't get our arms around it. None of us can do anything about it. It's wrong. It's pollution. It's nothing but a pollution that we have emitted as human beings, and we need to address it. We have faced every other pollutant like it's within our grasp to address it, and we have been enormously successful. Other air pollutants, the conventional pollutants, we've reduced 70% of all of those since EPA came around, while the GDP has nearly tripled. That's not a bad record of success. Why are we treating carbon pollution as something unique, something that is so far removed from what we could ever do that we're all sitting on our hands wondering what the federal government is going to do? Well, I'll give you a big clue. I've worked in local government, I've worked in state government, I've worked in federal government. Nothing ever starts at the federal government level that is good to do. Many things start that you're like, who thought of that? I'm serious. Everything that the federal government does is a result of grassroots levels fighting for about 20 years, and then it goes to the state level, and then because the state doesn't want everybody doing something different, so the state does something, then regions do something, then the federal government has to step in and correct this patchwork of dramatic changes that they need to fix. And then they come in and they announce this big innovative strategy, which is exactly what the grassroots organizers were pushing for 25, 30 years ago. Well, let's cut the timeline here, folks. Let's not worry about what's happening at the federal government. Let's worry about what's happening in our own communities. Let's worry about the communities that have been left behind, because climate change and climate science isn't about what's happening to the planet, with all due respect for all the planetary health people. We worry more about the health of human beings than we do about the health of our planet. Certainly they're related. Certainly they impact one another. But when push comes to shove, what do I care about? I care about myself. I care about my family. I care about my grandson. Put a face on climate change. Don't make it some nameless, obscure science that everybody in academics is worried about and everybody in politics is in dispute about. Let's talk about our own lives. Let's talk about the communities that have been impacted by pollution, pollution that still keeps them down, pollution that will be worse in a changing climate. Let's talk about the equity issues around that. Let's talk about what it means for those communities and the growth of our overall economy. Why do you think democracy is so hard today? It's because you have the rich and the poor. Climate change will exacerbate that. And we have to get at this issue. We have to stop worrying so much about planetary issues and personalize it. Make it part of what you do. That is what I do for a living. I am not going to let you get away in front of me talking about polar bears. They're very cute far away. They're not cute close up. And they're not what I worry about in a changing climate. I want my world to be my world. I don't want it to be dictated by pollution that was emitted 20 years ago or 20 years from now. I want my children to be healthy today. I want people who aren't healthy because they're inundated by pollution to actually get investment in how to take care of that. And I think climate change can be turned into the biggest opportunity we have to address those issues rather than the drama of climate science and challenges with climate change. Let's turn the challenge into an opportunity. Let's stop letting the federal government take the science away from us and start using it to make the world a better place for all of us. That's what we have to do. That's not what's happening today. Now, let me tell you what's happening today in Washington. I'm going to go through this quickly because it's a depressing litany, but you need to hear it and get over it. First of all, they are denying climate science. Most of us aren't. Check that box. They are taking climate information off the webpage. Now, why would anyone do that? It's just so that information isn't available to the public, because as we all know since the 60s, information is power, And the more information you have, the more you get empowered to do something about it. Well, there are many folks that have that information, including this university. We can find it elsewhere. Let's keep talking about it. Let's get climate science out of partisan politics. Let's get it at our kitchen table. Let's get it on our Main Street. Let's get it all the way to Wall Street. Let's talk about it. Let's fix it. Let's tackle it. Let's not worry about what EPA has or doesn't have on their webpage. They're stopping all the agencies from considering carbon pollution in decision making. Now, this is one that I find particularly humorous, because I got a degree in environmental engineering. I was terrible at it, so don't quote any of my engineering statistics. But the one thing I do know is that wastewater treatment facilities hardly ever work well when they're underwater. So generally, the courts can be convinced, and have been, that it's really not a good idea to spend huge federal infrastructure dollars and not think about climate change. So that's not working out real well for them. And they're changing the way the social cost of carbon is calculated by eliminating all the benefits outside the United States. Of course, climate change is an international, worldwide issue. And they're requiring a higher discount rate. Now, that is a really boring thing to rally around, but it is fundamentally one of the challenges that we are facing today. Because if you can't figure out how to get rid of rules that the Obama administration put in place, that you've promised your base that you're going to get rid of, and you're a brand new EPA administrator coming in, and you want to do what your job is supposed to do, you actually have a dilemma, because you can't really fight the rules we did, not on their face. The only thing you can do if you really want to succeed in court is to try to change the rules of the game, to get the science information over there, not displayed in reality in the fundamentals of the benefit and cost analysis related to rules. You can do things like they're doing, which says, I'm no longer going to count co-benefits, so that when I do a rule like the Clean Power Plan that's actually going to result in fewer coal-burning facilities, I'm no longer allowed to start looking at all the other conventional pollutants that sort of march along with carbon and get reduced, and all the lives saved, all the kids that don't any longer have asthma attacks, all the parents who can go to school because they're not home taking care of their sick kids, all those are no longer going to be counted. And they can eliminate direct benefits of rules. Now, this is one that I find really kind of cute, because it's so in your face. I did something called the Clean Water Rule, and they decided that they would no longer look at the benefits of wetlands. Now, I don't know about you, but I find wetlands to be sort of inexplicably and inextricably tied to water issues. They matter. They have value. Well, not any longer. And they've decided that those pesky science advisory boards that used to advise them, they were really slanted way too much towards real scientists. So instead, we should just put industry representatives on there and tell any scientist that has ever had an EPA grant that they're no longer eligible to be on the advisory board, when you can actually put a lobbyist with direct interest in the issue at hand on those science advisory boards. How is that going to change anything? Well, you tell me. What do you think is going to happen? And they've actually started whittling away at all of the air quality standards that we have put in place by basically saying that science that has been developed at Harvard University, where I work, and others, is no longer eligible to be considered, because they are not giving up personal information about participants in the really long studies that they have been doing for decades, that has been the basis of so much rulemaking at EPA and beyond. All of this is kind of crazy, but it's not rallyable, which is a new word that I've just made up. It is hard to get people excited about it. But if you believe that I do, that we did the rules right and they're going to stick around, the challenge we're facing is that the underlying structure of the agency is starting to wiggle. because EPA is a science agency. It is our scientists who we rely on that tells us the rules of the road that I need to consider and others when we make decisions. And it's important for us not to lose sight of those challenges. So today and tonight, this panel can't just be about climate science, but it is science in general. It's about the attack on science and the attack on scientists themselves. Because when I went to Harvard, I found out very quickly that every time some of our scientists do groundbreaking work on things like air pollution, they spend the next month just answering comments from junk science, who has commented to the journal that they published in. And it's a tremendous waste of time because you are fighting not a scientist, but in essence, a junk scientist. And we have to stop that, because it is disillusioning those scientists. It is taking their time when it could be developed and used for other things. And it's important for us to defend the scientists and the science moving forward. That is the lifeblood of what we all do. That is what has underpinned the innovation in this country, the entrepreneurship. We are nowhere near where we need to be on climate change, even if we embrace all the science that we know exists and we have to listen to. We are very good at getting to 2025. We need new science invested in today if we expect to get the next leap in technology forward that is going to get our carbon reductions down to the levels that science demands. We cannot take 8 years of waffling here, folks. 8 years of deteriorating the way in which people think about EPA and think about science itself. So my message to you is, don't sit quietly on the sidelines. You cannot do it. We can't sit around and watch Netflix and, in particular, Games of Thrones for 7 years and eat ice cream, which, by the way, is fun one night. You pay for it the next 10 days. You have to stay in the game. You have to get involved. While other people may not understand or be clued into what's going on in science, you're going to be clued in today. You're going to listen to the damage that the question on science and the challenge in our scientists can mean. So we have to get involved. We have to even potentially keep marching with all of the other wonky little scientists who march and had really great little signs that they carried moving forward, like society should worry when geeks have to demonstrate. I love that one. Having spent some time at Harvard, I totally agree. And we have to do things like what we're doing at Sea Change, which is my center at Harvard. We have to speak for the scientists who can't actually speak clearly for themselves. They talk to other scientists really well. The rest of us are like, pachoo, what was that? We have to talk to people, make it relevant to everybody's life. Make them understand what it means to them. What does it mean in my life? What does climate change actually do to my family, to my children, to their future? What does it mean for the health of those communities left behind? And even better, what are the solutions on climate change that will lift everybody's boat? How do we align those? How do we generate momentum rather than all this kind of anxiety that we're feeling today? So I will tell you that I remain tremendously hopeful, but we will only get there if we all keep our foot on the gas, accelerator, and put your faith in human ingenuity and entrepreneurship. Fight for the science. Defend the scientists. That's how this country has always moved forward. That is what it is going to take to turn climate change challenge into an opportunity for all of us. Thank you very much. Well,
Gina, you're an impossible act to follow. Your call to arms to defend the reality principle for every person in this room, for everyone who's watching this on live stream, for everyone who will watch this on video later on, for everyone you speak to. The call to arms to defend the reality principle is our struggle, is our mission, is what we'll do. I'm Nancy Anderson. I'm the executive director of the Sallan Foundation and a co-sponsor of this evening's panel. I want to thank all of you for being here. Climate Week in New York City is a feast of interesting, important events of all kinds, and that you chose to be here tonight. My co-sponsors, Mike Gerard and Mike Berger of the Sabin Center for Environmental Law, the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, headed up by Laura Kurtz, the Earth Institute, and all the support people who kept us from tearing every last hair out of our head as we were making this event happen this evening. Each of us want to thank each of you for being here, and for once you leave this evening and go back to your workaday lives tomorrow, to take this call to defend the reality principle and make it happen. I'd like to just take a moment to reiterate one of Gina's concerns in her message, and it's my message too. Attacks on climate science didn't start with Donald Trump, but he's legitimated them and made them go viral on Twitter, and as he converts the EPA and other federal agencies into tools of destruction. This damage to the credibility of climate science is as much cultural as it is political, and attacks on it won't disappear on their own when Trump leaves office. We need to both resist and persist in our defense of the reality principle. I'd like to now introduce and turn the evening over to, I guess, what you would usually call a distinguished panel. I would go beyond that and say, as climate scientists and climate media and journalists, we have this evening with us thought leaders and practitioners who are setting a new bar, a new challenge for all of us. John Swartz is the moderator of this evening's panel. I'd like to take just a moment to introduce John. He is a science writer for the New York Times, focusing on climate science. He's written for the Times since 2000 and has covered law, technology, the space program, infrastructure, and more. His work has appeared in nearly every section of the Times, including the book review, Science Times, and the arts section, so we have a Renaissance moderator tonight. Before coming to the New York Times in 2000, he worked at the Washington Post and Newsweek. He was born in Texas and is married to his college sweetheart, Jean Mixon. They have 3 grown children. I turn it over now to the panel, and John will briefly introduce our panelists. For full panelist bios, please go to sallan.org, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much. Wasn't that a tremendous speech by Gina McCarthy? And speaking as a Texan, it's just great to hear the accent of my native land. It took a while, right?
It did.
Okay.
That joke was like Gina's joke.
Okay.
You're not Gina.
I'm not Gina, but I changed. Welcome to Fighting Back Against Attacks on Climate Science. The movie version, by the way, will be called Climate Smackdown, which sets up the inevitable blockbuster sequel, Climate Smackdown 2. This time it's personal. And finally, a Climate Smackdown Christmas, a very special episode. I'm kidding. As a newspaper reporter, I, of course, do not actually have opinions, but this panel does. And besides, these people are not Smackdown brawlers. It's more like this. As they say in the old Westerns, they're peaceable people, but they don't back down from a fight. When I started writing about climate science and found that people could claim to have debunked my stories, I would hear from them, especially on Twitter, and they would cite weird, cherry-picked factoids and shift ground to other arguments once I'd made my point, and whenever I'd refute one, it all felt very familiar. You see, I had spent years covering the space program, and this was the kind of argument tactics that were thrown at me by people who believed we hadn't actually landed on the moon. But in fact, today, that group of people is very small. The group of people who don't accept climate science is much larger, and the fight to defend actual science against that kind of thinking is harder. That's what these folks are here to talk about tonight. I could open by giving you full introductions of everyone on the panel, but their bios are all online at the site here. So, and we don't have a lot of time, and I'm not being paid by the word. However, a brief introduction is in order. And so we're going to have personal statements to open up by each of these people. So I'm going to open with Robin Bell, who's a professor at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and president-elect of the AGU. Robin?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Gina, for your comments. I am one of those wonky scientists, I resisted. I didn't bring my PowerPoint. I thought I'd show you guys some wiggles. I love wiggles, I have to tell you. I really embrace science. But I'm going to talk to you about three things. I'm going to talk to you how I deal about science and denying climate from both my viewpoint as a scientist, my day job, the fact I'm a resident of this planet, and then I'm a citizen. Just to give you the kind of things that I think about and do. As a scientist, I just really try hard not to preach, If I brought you my favorite wiggles, or maybe even my favorite animation, I work on those places those weird polar animals live that Gina thinks, she doesn't like. I work at both poles, But oh, no, I didn't either. Did I say polar bears are cute? No. The stuffed one in my office is. The little tiny stuffed animal. But, when I try and explain to people, yes, the ice sheets are changing, I really like trying to avoid words like gigatons. I don't know about you, but I can never remember what a gigaton is. It's a big number. But I just tell them, I say, look at the data. It shows the ice. I can do it with one hand. I've practiced. The ice sheets are going faster. Wow, that's one measurement we make. Both ice sheets are going faster. Wow, that's cool. Then I tell them, wow, ice is kind of like mozzarella cheese on a pizza. And when it stretches, it gets thinner. So guess what? The ice sheets are getting lower. Wow, that's a second line of evidence. And this is kind of like that thing you learned in elementary school. You use different measurements to come to the same conclusion. And then I say, you won't guess this, but we have another measurement. We figure out how much they weigh, and they weigh less in the same place. So you can do it with one hand. You speed up, you drop, you lose in mass. 3 signals, 3 measurements. You can make up your mind if you think I'm making this up, but so that's my approach to, as a scientist. I try not to preach. I say, I'm going to show you the data. Make up your own mind what you think the data says. But I think it's also really important. I had the honor to serve on the panel that reviewed the National Climate Assessment this year, which meant I got to read all 985 pages of it. But it was really cool because it meant I got to learn a lot about the climate impacts all through the US. And it really made me appreciate that not everybody is seeing our planet and how it's changing the same. There are places on our planet, well, we know there are places in the US that don't have coastlines. So they don't care about my science, right? They don't care if I'm throwing icebergs in the ocean. But there are places where it's actually not getting warmer. There are places, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, it's not getting warmer. So you can, most of us are feeling it getting warmer, but there are places that aren't. It was really self-reflective to go, oh, okay. Our house being the planet we live on, does not change the temperature the same everywhere. So, that's kind of how I approach it as a scientist, recognizing what the data is and recognizing how varied the signal is. As a resident of this planet, I try and look for the things that I can share with people that they may be experiencing. One of my favorites is the longer growing seasons. The fact that most everybody is having 10 more days to grow their peas. I only harvested my grapes last night. The growing seasons are longer. In California, they're up to 50 days longer. Don't know why, they might be longer, but maybe it's because it's warmer. If you don't like to grow, if you live on the coast, think about the fish. People who are fishing in the Gulf of Mexico are not catching the flounder they like to eat anymore. They're catching gray snappers. Guess what? Gray snappers like warm water better than flounder. Or if you go up along the coast where Gina lives, you can actually see the fish moving north. The lobsters are moving north. The flounders are moving north. You can actually see, if you go offshore and you like to go offshore and fish, you're catching different fish. Again, it's beginning to think how instead of talking about gigatons or millimeters per year, one of those, wonderful things, actually talking about things people care about. How much sea level's gone up since my grandmother's born? There's a pipe down near the World Trade Center that's been in the water, right next to the Staten Island ferry. It's been in the water since my grandmother was born. If you put your hand on your leg just below your knee, that's how much sea level has gone up since my grandmother was born in the last 100 years. Pretty cool. It's just a friggin' pipe in the water. You can see every tide. You can see Sandy. Not a very high-tech measurement. It does seem like things are changing. If you drive 30 miles up the road here on the edge of the river, you can see houses that are up an entire story. You know why? Because Sandy smashed the shoreline even 30 miles up the river, and it looks like New Orleans where we're rebuilding. It's not New Orleans, it's New York State. So that's my approach as a resident. I share the stories of where we live and the things people are seeing. I try and avoid the gigatons and the millimeters. And then what am I doing as a citizen? As a citizen, I feel, as a scientist, and as in my role as a leader of AGU, I actually have to share hope for solutions, and I have to share my personal responsibility for the problem. So it means that I actually keep track of my carbon budget. I know I'm not gonna meet probably what's a fair for the planet as Gina sees it if we were to consider everybody, but I'm aiming to come in maybe 7 tons, which is a third of what the US is. It means trying to be careful about which airplane travel I take. So that's one way I'm trying to be self-reflective, because I can't tell anybody what they should do to reduce their carbon. I have to figure out what I can do, because it's an individual solution. It's back to Gina's concept that this starts with the grassroots. This starts with individuals, not the federal government. I also like to talk about how solutions are cool. I drive an electric motorcycle. It's my favorite way to talk to people who are climate deniers, because we don't start talking about climate. We start talking about what incredible pickup my motorcycle has and how fast it goes, and it really scares the bejesus out of me. I don't tell them that. But then we talk about why we have an electric motorcycle, because solutions can be cool. An electric motorcycle, while it's quieter than a Harley, can probably go faster. So then the third thing is, as an organization, I think we have to encourage the organizations we are part of to put their credibility on their line and act as well. AGU is in the process of, hopefully by the fall meeting, when a lot of us geeks, wonks, go to Washington for the meeting, we'll be there. We have a net zero building. It'll be the first net zero renovation in Washington, D.C. And it, like everything, it's not one solution. It's a PV array, it's DC power for our computers, it's a green wall, and it's a heat pump into the sewer system. But it'll get us to net zero. So that's my approach to climate deniers. I have to do it both in my role as a scientist, a resident of this planet, and a citizen. So thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Moving from right to left or left to right, depending on which way you're facing, we're going to go to Lisa Garcia, who is Vice President of Litigation for Healthy Communities at Earthjustice and happened to be Gina's advisor at EPA.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy and Michael, for having me, and Gina for kicking us off. Always a pleasure being in a space with Gina McCarthy, my former boss and person who inspired us every day to do this work with vigor and energy, as you can see. So I told her I was going to repeat what she said, but with a New York accent, which was an ongoing joke. But I'm really happy to be here. And I guess I'll just kick it off by saying, well, the work that I was doing at the EPA and my contribution was on environmental justice. And so that's how I come to this a little bit, is understanding that, as Gina was mentioning, as we're all aware of, that really the impacts fall hardest on low-income communities, communities of color, indigenous communities across the world. And so even in the United States, you know, we saw the effects of Katrina, and fast forward to Puerto Rico from Maria, even just recently, Hurricane Florence, the flooding of the hog farms, and then the dam breaking and maybe causing coal ash to flood into communities. And the people who live usually next to the power plant or the coal ash pile or the hog farms are usually low-income communities, and most often communities of color. And so really when we talk about protecting people, we're really talking about people who maybe aren't at the table when we're making these climate science decisions, or they're not, they're certainly not running the EPA, let's say, right now. And so one of the things that we worked on, especially at the EPA and in, as Gina mentioned, implementing all these rules, was to make sure that we really based it on sound science, and that we brought in things like co-benefits to communities of color, to low-income communities. And the huge co-benefit, as was said, is the health benefits, reducing those health disparities. And so one of the things that I continue to focus on is the people piece. That's the driver here. And in my day job now at Earthjustice is really focusing on protecting those rules that we implemented while under the Obama administration, but even before then, that were based on sound science and protecting public health. And so what you see in the Trump administration under Pruitt is not only not listening to scientists or trying to roll back or to not allow experts on the Science Advisory Board, but really is attacking rules. And so at Earthjustice, with our partners from other environmental groups, public health groups, and also farm worker groups, is trying to make sure that they don't roll back the rules. So what you see is the Trump administration almost, there's a joke, like every 10 days we file a lawsuit, but they're really going systematically after every rule. And as Gina mentioned, the decisions were based on sound science. And so what we're seeing, and I'll knock on wood and not say it too loud, is we're winning the cases, we're challenging the administration, this administration, because they're not making decisions based on sound science. So for instance, there was a pesticide called chlorpyrifos. EPA had so much evidence saying that this pesticide was detrimental to people's health, and the courts upheld the EPA's decision to begin to ban this pesticide. The Trump administration came in and said, no, we need to study it more and more. And the Ninth Circuit basically said, there's enough evidence, you have 60 days to put this ban into effect, and that's it. And so for us, while yes, we're trying to, we're going at each case individually, the real commitment is to make sure that all of the science, all of that public health, all of those public health data and materials are saved, essentially, because even if I'm talking about pesticides, once you have a decision that says EPA can ignore the public health data, then it's dangerous for things like climate science and all the other statutes, right? So the environmental statutes say, as long as it's based on sound science, and we have to look at public health science, that we're going to uphold that rule. And that's why I think as lawyers and at Earthjustice, we're going after, or trying to, like I said with our partners, trying to save all of those different rules and regulations, because we can't let one fail, because that'll, in our minds, that'll weaken the stability of saying EPA has looked at the science, is justified in why they issued this rule, and we're going to uphold it, and that's where we want to stay. So that's taking up a lot of my day job, and we do preach. We do preach to the courts to uphold it. The other thing I would say that we're also paying attention to, once again with our partners, is this is the attacks on how scientists, on how studies make it into the EPA, and how EPA looks to their advisory boards on science, how they rely on some of the studies. And so, as Gina mentioned, it's a very dangerous thing that, for instance, Administrator Pruitt put out this directive that said, essentially, we're going to bar scientists who conducted EPA-funded research from serving on EPA federal advisory committees. So that means that any university, any institution that received federal funds from the EPA to do research, they no longer can serve as an advisor, as a science advisor to the EPA. And that's a very dangerous place to be, because that means they will only be relying on those who have the money to self-fund their studies, which, as Gina mentioned, makes sure that the advisory group would then be, heavy with industry or corporate interests. And that's a dangerous place to be. And then the other thing that I'll say that they issued recently, and we're tracking and challenging, once again, with partners, with environmental justice partners and farm worker and health partners, is what they're calling the proposed regulation on transparency in regulatory science. And this is another one. Transparency means that EPA would only rely on studies where they can identify, basically make public, the individuals who were part of that study. And as we know, I mean, I'll just take chlorpyrifos, the pesticide. If it's based on public health and the study was based on farm workers that said, okay, yes, you can take my blood samples or whatever, I become part of the study, farm workers, especially if 80% of them are Latinos, they probably don't want their name and their face and their address out in the public. But it's important because they're the ones that are out in the fields for us to be able to study them and maybe make sure that their names aren't out there in the public. So we decided, of course, there's a whole communications piece to this, and we said that it's the, that it's a false transparency, that really it's making sure that no study ever will make it into EPA's determination if you have to then say the only way that we can do this if we can identify every single person that was part of that study. So it really precludes EPA from using critical human health studies that rely on confidential medical information. And so those are the things that we're tracking and that we find are really important. We just have to almost like hold the gate or make sure that we're not letting things topple, even though things are coming out. We're out there challenging everything. And then I'll just say quickly, the other thing that I think as a citizen or as Gina mentioned, the cities really become the leaders. Like, how can I, in my city or in my municipality, make sure that we're pushing for changes? And the way that I see it is this is where I change the message a little bit is, wouldn't it be cool to have an electric scooter or an electric car? Like, let's look at the technology that we do have and get cities, go to our city council meetings or whatever. We see this in Los Angeles where they're looking at changing out their bus fleet to electric fleets. Like, we're just trying to name that or send the message that this is really cool. This is moving us truly into the 21st century. So I'm not getting into a science debate with you. I'm just saying, why not reduce pollution? Why not use the best technology and the newest technology out there? And eventually we get to the solution, the clean energy solutions. And I will say that a lot of it that I learned, and I'll go back to environmental justice, is communities across the board who were overburdened by pollution have really been at the forefront of moving towards reducing pollution. That has been their message all along. And when they say, let's electrify the ports, it's because of the huge diesel pollution that was causing health disparities in their community. But let's go back to that message that the EJ groups and the climate justice groups had, is like reducing pollution is a great thing for everybody, and hopefully we won't get into the pollution debate. So I would just say those are the issues that I'm focusing on and will really try to continue to focus on, hopefully just another year and a half until we have, another year and a half so we have some changes or hopeful changes in this administration so we can get back to doing the great work that EPA was doing. Thank you.
We have David Bielo, who is the science curator for TED and is the author of The Unnatural World. David?
Hi, everybody. And since I'm neither a scientist nor a lawyer, I guess I will speak to the communication piece, right? That's what I'm here for. So I'll start with the bad news for all you data wonks out there. More information is not going to help. People get it. People get that climate change is happening. They might not call it climate change, but they get that it's happening. And that's because climate change used to be so far off. It was something that was going to affect our grandchildren. And now it's affecting all of us in our day-to-day lives. You've already heard about Hurricane Sandy and the pipe, Hurricane Florence, you name it. It's a chronic condition now. Kind of like, I don't know, diabetes for the United States that we have to manage. We have to manage it. I'm sorry, that's where we're at. And unfortunately, part of that management strategy presently is for some of us to live in somewhat safe air-conditioned bubbles, and for some of the rest of us to live in very unsafe, low-lying floodplains at risk of a coal ash dam failing or whatever else it might be. So that's the bad news. The good news is that, well, I guess this is sort of good news, money works. There's a very well-funded effort to convince folks that we shouldn't do anything about climate change. And it totally worked. Jeff will probably tell you more about that.
And that's the good news?
Yeah, that's the good news. Wow. Yeah. Well, part of the good news. I'm building to the real good news, you know, the electric scooters. You know, this massive kind of disinformation campaign was effective. And if there was an equally well-funded good information campaign, hey, maybe something would change for the better. Trump, here's more good news. Trump is a passing phenomenon, and he hasn't tweeted too much about climate change, perhaps surprisingly, actually. Yeah, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. But the changes that he's making to places like the EPA could be much more long-lasting. And you heard a little bit about that, whether it's EPA scientists making some kind of extraordinary intervention to protect the coal-fired power plants that are the main source of carbon pollution, or whatever else it might be. Trump will go away, but we have to keep our eye on what's really the ball, which is the changes that are happening on his watch. And the other thing I would note, because I think it complicates a little bit our picture of the world we live in, this is not a partisan issue in my experience. I've been reporting on climate change for a couple of decades now, and I guess that's long enough to be cynical, but not long enough to be depressed. Give me a few more years. It's much more of a regional issue than a partisan issue. You will meet, if you come from the Midwest, like I do, plenty of folks who are skeptical of climate change and are Democrats. They might be farmers, they might be in some way tied to the extraction of fossil fuels, but they exist, and we ignore them at our peril. I think there's a stunning overlap in the political maps between whether a state or region relies for its economic well-being on the extraction of fossil fuels or not. And that's important to note if we're going to go out and fight climate denial effectively. I would also note that there's kind of a new threat that I'm starting to notice. I don't know if you've noticed this as well, but there are many folks on what I would call the traditional left who have given up, kind of a defeatism. We've lost, can't be done, let's move on to the next fight. And I'm just here to say, or to warn you, that that is as damaging, potentially, as climate denial has been. Don't give in to the defeatists. We got into this mess, we must find a way to go forward, because it can always get worse. And the final piece of good news is change. Have I really uplifted your spirits?
You haven't given us the good news yet. Come on.
This is it.
Right,
Here it
okay.
is.
I'm having such a great time.
Well, you know, I wanted to go counter to type, right?
Yeah.
Ted is all about optimism, and you know, I wanted
It's
to keep
because
it
you
real.
don't have slides, isn't it?
It's true. I'm punishing you for the lack of pictures. Change, when it comes, can happen extremely quickly. What we're talking about here is an energy transition. And if you look at kind of energy transitions around the world, they can take a matter of decades. If you look at pictures of New York City, where we are right now, around the turn of the century, in the early years, let's say 1900, it's all horses. By 1910, it's mostly cars. That happened practically overnight. So it can happen. There is hope that these electric scooters and electric cars can be the future of transportation. The real important thing, though, is that they're not powered by coal-fired power plants, and that's why we have to keep our eye on what the Trump administration is up to.
Right, thank you, David. And finally, we have Jeff Nesbitt, who is the executive director at Climate Nexus. If you haven't seen the website, I suggest you check out their newsletter, among other things. He's also the author of This Is the Way the World Ends, so you know he's a really chipper guy.
Defeatist!
There you go.
There you go. Oh, good placement.
It's easy.
It's good. He's so good. And just for grins, I'll let you know that the first time I interviewed Jeff Nesbitt was 1993. So we've known each other for a while. That was back when he was fighting tobacco
That's
orange juice.
And orange juice as well. I'm always happy to talk about that. I will say, your story, that's an amazing, the New York Times has two pictures, one from 1905 and one from 1910. The iconic picture of the Macy's Day Parade on Thanksgiving on Fifth Avenue here in New York. In 1905, it was all horse-drawn carriages. Just 5 years later, exact same parade, exact same Fifth Avenue, all cars. So in just 5 years. So that's absolutely the case. I've used that in presentations before. It can happen in a hurry. I wanted to make four quick points, but before I do, I wanted to tell two sort of personal stories, but I think speak to the larger issue here that we're trying to debate. The first is, as John alluded, so when I was at the FDA, and both of these were in Republican administrations, so which helps considering the current administration. So the idea for the FDA to regulate the tobacco industry, as John knows, was my truly psychotic idea. I mean, I just proposed it. It made no sense. I fought like crazy for that to happen. Now, many years later, it's the law of the land. We have a tobacco center at the FDA. There was a law. It took years and years. But in the middle of that fight, once we got into the teeth of it, the science of it became pretty apparent and obvious to us. And the first was we had to learn from the industry. Basically, we had to learn the secrets of the industry. The first secret was that they had bought scientists everywhere. And I mean literally bought them everywhere. There was a scientist network at established universities. They were paid to corrupt the science. They were paid to question the science. They were paid to talk about, to basically raise the question whether tobacco actually killed us, whether it caused small cell lung carcinomas. So we had to dispel that. It was a long effort, but we had to do that first. And then once we got into the teeth of it, one of the things that we discovered was that the industry knew more about the science than we did. And one of the most nefarious discoveries we made was that they knew that nicotine was the most addictive product on the face of the earth, and that children were addicted within the first 10 cigarettes, which explained their marketing approach for why you give away 10 packs near playgrounds. We had to learn that. We then had to prove it, and then we had to give it to the public. So that's the first personal story, and we eventually did win. So you can win on some of these, even the most difficult issues. The second, the personal story I want to tell, I was at the National Science Foundation. I ran their legislative and public affairs offices, career. Happy to explain how that happened, but in the second Bush administration, I commissioned a study that Robin might remember. We wanted to just ask up to more than 100 National Science Foundation scientists, what do we know about climate science? Just ask the question, answer it. And we interviewed them, and we did a seminal report. It was really the first sort of federal report that said, what do we know about climate science? We issued it. It was an official side event at an international climate negotiation. It was called What We Know, and we issued a very nice report. My reward for doing that was the Republican staff on the Hill triggered an Inspector General investigation of me for politicizing the issue. Simply asking the question about whether climate science, what do we know about climate science? So I just wanted to tell you those two stories as backdrop before I got to the main points that I wanted to make here at this discussion. The first is, here's the good news, and John will know this and might not say this, but I'll just say it outright. Climate science denial in the mainstream media is almost completely gone now. And that's a good thing. And what I mean by that is, for any reporter who covers this issue, they no longer entertain the nonsense from those who are funded to promote climate science denial outright or even questions. Even the conservative media largely avoids it, other than Breitbart, because they know it's a loser. It is now a loser. It is a losing proposition to talk about this. And the only ones who are left promoting this are the Mercers who fund the Heartland Institute and a couple of others. So, and what's more, the elected federal Rs don't talk about it either, because they get in trouble very quickly when they start to talk about climate science. So that's actually the good news. This is in the media. I'm not talking about the Republican Party at large and whether elected Rs talk about it. The second thing, though, is that the elected Republican officials, the elites and the conservatives, they've gotten much, much more sophisticated about how they talk about this. They're now willing to say, yes, the climate is changing, and generically that mankind plays some role in it. But we don't know what's really to blame for that process. We don't know who really to blame for that. And what's more, we don't know what might happen 50 years from now. So let's just wait. Let's just see how bad it's going to get in 2100. They've laid this very interesting trap. They've tried to be very cute about it. So that's the second sort of big sea change that's occurred quite recently. So what this has done, and this is the third point I wanted to make, is that this has created a difficult, insidious formula for scientists. It is really difficult for climate science to deal with this because, for one, there are uncertainties in science. We all know that. Robin, you and all your colleagues know that. That's what you wrestle with. Science is called the endless frontier for a reason. You're constantly trying to answer these questions. So scientists argue in good faith all the time about things like climate sensitivity or extreme event attribution. That's what they do. That's what the scientific community does. And so they're constantly doing that. That provides an opportunity for those who want to delay or stop or redirect this to cherry pick those uncertainties. So they're very good at doing that. And that's why the upcoming debate about whether we're going to see tipping points at 1.5C or 2C, I guarantee you they will take those uncertainties and use those and exploit those for yet further delay and further obfuscation of this issue. And finally, it's what allows GOP elected leaders to say, let's just wait and see. The science community is still talking about uncertainties. Let's just wait and see. Let them settle all these uncertainties about all of this, how bad it's really going to get. Which leads to my final point, and the reason why, and I'm sorry for the shameless plug for this book, which is out tomorrow.
Oh, nice.
Do you like that, John?
Very well done.
Yeah.
You need to hold it up again.
All right. Out tomorrow.
Model. I can do it for you.
This is the way but the reason why I wrote this book is that climate impacts are here now. And I know that it's hard for scientists to talk about that, but they are here now. And in other parts of the world, they are really here now. We're lucky that in the United States we live in a temperate zone. But Yemen is effectively out of water. There's an entire chapter, and it's what triggered the civil unrest and the collapse of the government there. Saudi Arabia is effectively out of water. They foolishly decide to drain their aquifer and grow wheat and try to export it. They're effectively out of water now. China, the northern aspect of China, because of the Gobi Desert and some other things, they're starting to run out of water. We are starting to see impacts. Half the population on Earth right now has to eat imported food because food insecurity is a massive problem. It's connected to climate change is the 800-pound gorilla that sits over the top of all of this right now. But we're not talking about it. So we need to start talking about that, not way off in the future, but right now. And it's very difficult for the science community to do that because they would rather study things over decadal time periods. Too bad. We need to start talking about this now and be unafraid to talk about it. We also need to talk about, and it's very difficult to talk about things occurring now, but there is an upper limit for the carbon budget. There is an absolute upper limit. I don't know when we'll reach it. Maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years, could be 25 years, but there is an upper limit. And that's what 2C is about, and we need to learn a better way of talking about what that upper limit is for CO2 that we're putting in the atmosphere. The third point I would make is please, and for everybody in this room and anybody who wants to talk about this, please, please, please stop talking about the year 2100. Please, please. Nobody cares. Literally no one cares. We learned this in the tobacco fight that even teenagers who believe they're immortal, you scare them that they might get lung cancer, they might not see their grandkids, they don't care. It's not what stops them. What stopped them and kept them from smoking is when we convinced them that the tobacco companies were deceiving them and deliberately hooking them and addicting them and lying to them. That actually worked, but scaring them about future events didn't. And finally, I have a public bet with Justin Gillis, John's longtime colleague and friend, that he believes that the only thing that will pass Congress is a national clean energy standard. I actually genuinely believe, and I think we'll get there, we will get to a somewhat bipartisan climate law with a national policy solution in just about 3 years, because we're almost there in the country. We're at about 75% of the country that generally wants to see something. The other 25% is focused on climate science denial and denying that it's occurring, but I think we're going to get there. So we need to recognize, one, that the clean energy revolution is here, most people get it, and two, that most of the country wants to actually accept the science and do something about it.
All right. So before we get to your questions, I've got a couple of questions for the members of the panel. I think I'll open with Robin and have anybody pitch in with anything that they want to bring up. But we're talking about attacks on climate science. We've also mentioned the attacks on climate scientists personally, that anyone who gets into climate science and who is public in talking about it is sure to get attacked. Anyone who engages on social media to explain climate science is going to get attacked, especially women. And what is the effect? And there's an organization, one of the sponsors of this event, Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, is here to help pay for and conduct the legal defense of climate scientists whose emails are investigated, who at public institutions, and who come under this kind of attack. So I was wondering if we could talk about that pressure on climate scientists and what does it do to them.
So first of all,
you got the AGU.
I've got the AGU. The AGU stands behind scientists, and I think you find that your institution will stand behind you. Gavin Schmidt is certainly somebody who's been in the middle of it. He's here with us today. He's certainly one who's battled this. And I think it's a real issue. I think what worries me is the people it drives from our field. Because while Jeff is hopeful that clean energy will solve all the problems, and we don't care about 2100, but I still believe that if, as residents of our planet, we actually have to know how it's going to respond in the coming decades. And for that, we need the smartest people, and we need the most diverse brains at the table. And these attacks drive the talent from the field of science and technology that we need. So I think that's the one that scares me the most, is that we're losing the really smart people who we would really like to help work on the health of our planet, or as Gina calls us, the planetary health people. You know?
And she hates polar bears.
She doesn't hate them. She just doesn't want us to keep talking about them.
The Heartland Institute once taught me that polar bears are the enemy of the American way of life. So we should all hate polar bears. But I would note that if you really want a sense of what's coming in our future, just watch what political types do to climate scientists. ClimateGate, which some of you may remember, was kind of a trial run for what happened in our most recent presidential election. So keep your eye on climate scientists if you want to know kind of the next suite of tricks that may be tried on our broader democracy.
And my bet is the same bad actors, I don't have proof of this, the same bad actors who are behind the 2016 election may have been behind ClimateGate as well. We still don't know who perpetrated ClimateGate, but they had all the same Russian hackers. Yeah. So, for what it's worth.
Oh,
Okay. Move the mic closer.
I was just going to say that, I mean, I agree that we're worried about, especially young girls not getting into science generally and technology, as you said, and then when there are these attacks, it makes it more difficult. So I think, I mean, we're just trying the counter narrative. I know that even within my group of friends, going to the climate march and having our kids wear T-shirts. I mean, just trying to, right? We're actually neighbors, David and I. So
strong Gowanus representation on this panel.
Exactly. So, right? I mean, we get our kids involved and our neighbors involved, and while it may not be resonating as loudly as the administration, but in the ways that we can. And of course, when things started happening, and scientists were leaving a lot of the organizations, trying to make sure that we hire those people and that they're safe and there are jobs and there are people that respect your work and want this to continue. So in our own little ways, every organization and even in our neighborhoods, to continue to have that counter narrative and just be strong about it in our own way. Yeah.
Okay. David, you had mentioned before that defeatism, that it's all over. You sort of framed it as another kind of climate denial, that we've got nothing to do. What's the danger there? And in terms of science messaging, the sort of underlying question here, what do we know about positive versus negative messages, hope versus gloom? Just, what would you say about that?
So the danger there is that we just give up and let things kind of proceed the way they are, because if it's all doomed anyway, why don't we just go out and eat a hamburger and drive the biggest truck we can possibly get our hands on and wait for the world to end? Unfortunately, that kind of strand of defeatism is, in a weird way, kind of reaffirms the status quo. I don't think that's their stated intention, or they're being paid to do that, but that is what ends up being the effect. So yeah, that's what I'd say the danger there is.
And I think one of the things that really worries me is that, and I can't quite see the picture on the cover of your book. Is the world awful? No, okay, it's kind of cracky and awful.
Yes, it's the iconic desert.
The iconic desert. And what I worry, and this comes from, I used to demonstrate sea level by showing how much I'd buy little model train homes, right? And then I'd demonstrate how I could drown them.
That's dark.
That is. Ooh.
And I just remember the day this little boy was standing there looking at this awesome demonstration. I could do green water for Greenland and Antarctica, and it went different levels up on the house. And I realized that fear does not work. I looked at this little boy's face and it's like, oops, last time for this awesome demonstration. Then you'll notice I didn't talk about how I'm going to drown you. I talked about because that is my job, right? My job is to figure out how I'm going to drown you and flood your home. But that doesn't really make for a conversation or any hope. That's why I'm very careful to talk about things that you can feel, things that you can see in your community, and to talk about how beautiful, I didn't actually get to this, but our planet is beautiful, and I object to us always showing pictures of the ugly cracked desert, or for my job thinking that the ice is all going away. There's a lot of ice. If they just need people to study ice, the ice is going to be around past 2100. People like me will have jobs, if that's what the goal is. But it's again this sense of we want this, our home, to have a sense of our home, planet Earth, to be a beautiful place and someplace we can live with. We don't want to sort of adopt the Elon Musk, which kind of looks like that. Mars, where he wants to go, doesn't look that much different than the picture on your front of your book.
Oh, it's way worse.
Yeah.
Right.
I will say, I didn't pick the cover, but
Oh, that's okay. I'm not
in my own defense, on my Twitter account, I have the left-hand side is the cracked desert that morphs into a very green, verdant Earth. So I will say
cool.
that.
No, but I think it's this sense of our responsibility for our home and the hope for a future is absolutely critical.
And also the other thing, Dave, that's a really interesting point that you bring. That, and you are correct. There is quite a bit of despair, and what that does is when people feel like they can't actually make a difference, they're going to go do other things. They're going to tackle poverty. They're going to go to other places. And if they're under attack as climate scientists, I can tell you at the National Science Foundation, we had to actually hide the research titles in order to get funding from Congress. We didn't call it the Climate Science Research Program. We called it something else that didn't have the word
environmental
climate.
Change.
Exactly. We had no choice. We had to do that in order to assure that the money kept flowing to climate research. But it scares the researchers away. It scares the philanthropists away who feel like, well, I don't want to be wasting my dollars. And it scares the talent away who can actually solve the problem. So if that despair takes root, we're all in a lot of trouble. Then the second major point is we still have time to turn this around, and I believe we will turn this around. I believe we will see an energy transformation. I believe it will occur every bit as fast as the tech industry transformation changed the information industry. I believe we'll see that in energy. We have to, but it does start. We can neither be despairing nor can we be too afraid of radical change. So that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, I would say, I completely agree. Don't despair, and a lot of times it does take a long time. I was going over some of my talking points with a friend, and I said, I'm going to read this point that every discovery in public health, no matter how significant, must compete with the traditions, assumptions, and financial incentives of the society trying to implement it. And so, to me, that just means that we're in this moment right now where we are up against people challenging it, but we're on the cusp of the change. And so, one of the examples was, the seatbelt was invented way before it was mandatory in cars in the 1960s, or the first confirmed death from asbestos exposure was recorded in 1906. And it wasn't until 1973 that it was banned. Wow. So the reason she said not to say it was because that's a 70-year gap, and that's not positive. But since we already heard we've been in the middle of climate science for many years, I thought maybe we're not at the 70-year mark. So, but I completely agree. Yeah, that with everything, it takes time, and you're always going to be up against this wave of the political aspirations or whims and fear of some other people to make that change. But we have to stay positive, I guess.
So, doom and gloom doesn't work. So you say. I still want to see the definitive.
I'd like to challenge. Do you mind if I challenge that a little bit?
Please, that's where I was going.
So, well, do you want me to let you finish your question?
No.
Just jump right into the doom and gloom.
I want people to jump in. If I'm doing my job, everybody forgets I was here.
No one can
Impossible.
forget that you're here. And by the way, John has a new book that everybody in this room needs to read. Wow. Can I just say?
This is
What's the
really
ti-
not the
I need
forum
to-
to talk about a
come
book
on.
with the
So
title.
when we write a book, come to you, obviously, right?
Yes.
Right, no,
What's,
exactly.
what's the title?
Promote it.
The title is This is the Year I Put My Financial Life in Order. It has nothing to do with climate change.
It is a wonderful book, though. It's about John who spent most decades ignoring his financial health and decided late in life that he better figure this out. So,
You see, stay
So there you go.
optimistic.
There
Sounds like
are
a lot like
parallels.
climate change.
There are parallels.
there you go.
But you were saying.
So, all right, and I'm going to use my daughter as a prop. She would hate this, but she's not here, so too bad. So she's a physician. She's the chief resident in pediatrics at UCSF Children's in San Francisco. And what Elizabeth would say is what any doctor would say was, when you go to the bedside, you have to talk about the problem. You don't skirt the issue that you're dealing with, and then you deliver the treatment plan. They go hand in hand. That's what any good physician would do. So, and what so doom and gloom doesn't work, but it certainly wakes people up. You need to know what the problem is that you're facing. We need to know collectively at the local level, at the national level, at the global level, we need to know what we're really up against. And then we need to have a very serious conversation about how we fix it. That's the treatment plan. They go hand in hand. So yes, doom and gloom, it's the old traditional public health model. You deliver both at the same time. You have to. So that's my argument. So one doesn't work, and Pollyannish optimism about a clean energy revolution, absent the problem that we're facing and what's going to solve, doesn't work as well. So that would be my challenge.
Okay, what else works?
I still think what else works is explaining the wonder of our planet and how there's still a lot to discover about how our planet works. You know, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have still been just drowning each. I would have drowned the houses in New York the same as I drowned the houses in Australia, regardless of what ice sheet. But it turns out the ice sheets have a gravitational effect, and like if she was Greenland and I'm the ocean, I'm leaning up next to her. So it turns out that Greenland, this is way counterintuitive, Greenland doesn't matter for New York as much as Antarctica does. And like, wow, we didn't know that 5 years ago. Isn't that kind of cool? That the ocean leans up against her, the ice sheet. Wow. And it matters because she has a halo around her and we live in the Greenland halo. So Miami doesn't. So Greenland and Miami are problems. but we care about Antarctica because we don't live in the Antarctica halo. And we didn't know that. There's still so much to discover about how our planet works. So to me, that's a message in terms of making sure we don't move into this without understanding how our planet works. That, yeah, the doctor needs to deliver the message, but the doctor better know how the patient's blood flows.
Absolutely, I agree.
And I gotta go because I need to catch a train instead of a plane to keep my carbon footprint on. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
So let me take a quick. I want to take a quick run of that as well. What works? Because the organization, we just conducted a very large poll in Florida. We just wanted to test this question: what works? Specifically, when you ask voters who are going to vote in the midterms, you start with the baseline question. It was a very large poll, like almost 4,500 registered. It's a massive poll for a single state. And we really wanted to test that question. So you start with the baseline, and as it always happens in these polls, climate change is way down the list. Nobody cares about climate change. As a voting issue, it's always the case. It's like 9th or 10th or 11th. And healthcare is way up here. Gun violence is way up here in Florida. Concerned about jobs and the economy, as it always is here. But then we started to test something throughout this extensive poll. It's called a push poll, but it was a very deep push poll. We wanted to test local impacts, things that they could see out their window, like the hurricane impacting Jacksonville or South Florida, or police cars that have saltwater intrusion, or marshes that are losing their salinity, and there's a back and forth. Local impacts to the community, to the economy, and then we paired it with a highly aspirational message. Wouldn't you like to see Florida become the solar revolution of the world, the Sunshine State, lead the world in solar revolution? And lo and behold, what we discovered was the combination of local impact that they could see, not distant, in time, happening right now, compared with a highly aspirational message. It jumped all the way to the top, right next to healthcare as a reason why they would go to the polls. So what that tells us is we're missing the narrative here. We're missing the story. We need to start talking about how this is real and it's happening to us around us. And I think most people get that now. And I think if we do that, and then you combine it with, wouldn't you like to see a way out of this problem that's real and tangible and that you can be proud of and can lead to jobs? I think if we do that, if we can figure this out, I think we succeed.
I think I was just going to say I was going to mention something similar, that we have to figure out what the message is that resonates with people, and it's a diverse population. It's a population that doesn't all live in New York City or doesn't all live in Kansas, right? So how are we developing and making sure that we're getting the message across and making it resonate with how they live, where they live? And jobs is a huge one. So if you talk to a farm worker about climate change, maybe they are not really that interested. But if you talk to them about being in the field when it's 110 degrees and the regulation for applying pesticides requires them to use equipment, protective equipment, that they now have to put a jacket on or a mask on, and they're in 110-degree weather, you can explain to them that can lead to heat stroke, right?
Absolutely.
Anyway, and so how are we talking to different people and to children that resonates differently with when we're talking to abuelita and grandma, right? And I do think that we just have to take the time. I mean, everyone was shouting about climate, or maybe it's just in my world. Everyone was shouting about climate in the last election, and no one cared. No one went to the polls because of climate change. And that was on us, and It was that we weren't sending the message, because obviously it's impacting people's day-to-day lives, but what was missing from that message? Yeah,
absolutely.
I would add, though, that when you talk about Florida has been more receptive to climate discussion and climate arguments for at least 5 years. They've got a 4-county compact that brings hundreds of people together more than once a year to talk about the impact of climate change on their counties, and the same attitudes in the Yale climate study. Attitude study can be seen in the Panhandle as well, wherever the water really hits.
Yes.
And the fact that people along the coast are having to spend a ton of money to push fresh water into their aquifers to block salinity from coming in with the rising sea levels. So, I mean, I'm not saying that you're cheating, but they've got some groundwork laid for you before you interviewed those 4,500 people.
They have, but we've done some of the same. We did some of the same work in Houston after the hurricane hit. So basically, whenever you start to see real impacts and people get it, I guarantee you that's what we're going to start to see. Again, I'll just go back. We are really lucky in the United States that we live in a temperate zone, and these really awful water scarcity issues that are crushing sub-Saharan Africa right now aren't occurring in the United States. We are very lucky, but we're not that far away. I mean, the aquifer that runs beneath the same sort of aquifer that runs beneath Saudi Arabia and other places runs beneath the Central Valley in California, and it doesn't take too long before you drain it and you don't have adequately replenished fresh water into those aquifers. So we may start to see those sooner rather than later. But that's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to explain these severe impacts that are either happening now or right around the corner, because we haven't seen them in the United States. That doesn't mean they won't occur, and they may start to occur quite in the near future.
Where we even have seen kind of milder than that impacts, but still relatively severe. Even Republican politicians are pretty quick to get on board with action on climate change, whether that's in Florida or even Texas. And I think from a messaging standpoint, it's really about, you have to talk to people where they are, to answer your question.
Yeah, you do.
And you have to talk about what you're for, not just something terrible is going to happen to you if you don't listen to me.
Well, and some of these politicians find they can do more if they don't talk about it in terms of climate change.
Yeah.
They just say things are changing and here's what we need to do.
Yep.
Well, that's in Alaska, right? They have a whole fund for erosion from sea level rise and from storms. But, if they are asked to vote on reducing greenhouse gases, it's a resounding no. So they are actually pumping money into moving towns like Kaktovik or some of the native villages further upland because of coastal erosion, and they're not connecting. I mean, maybe quietly they're connecting the dots, but they're not publicly making those statements. Yeah,
It's tough to,
or Kevelina, one of those. Yeah,
it's tough to ask a person who's receiving a check in the mail from the oil industry to vote against the oil industry.
And these were attitudes that I ran into in doing the stories that showed up in February about coastal Louisiana and the relative sea level rise there being truly incredible, and this little town of Jean Lafitte, where I talked to person after person who said, "I'm losing my home, I'm losing my place," and I'd say, "Well, what about climate change?" And they'd say, "Well, I don't really believe that's happening because how could we have? It's such a big planet. How could we be having the effect?" And I say, "Well,
Thank you.
then what's happening to your home?" And they had several arguments, all of which were wrong, but they felt very strongly that it wasn't. That it had nothing to do with this thing, climate change. And one of them, one of these guys who I really came to like and owned a marina, said that he took his girlfriend to a movie, and before the movie started, they did trailers for the Inconvenient sequel. and he started shouting in the theater and said, "That's it, that's it." And he said the girlfriend just said, "Oh no, here he goes again." and he went up to the front desk and he demanded a refund. And he said, I don't need Al Gore yelling at me. And his marina is going to go underwater.
Yeah.
But he just didn't want to hear it. And that's so when I say what works, part of it is what reaches him, or what reaches Uncle Walter at Thanksgiving. Individuals who are just set, or do you just say, these folks over here, I'm not going to try to argue with them because there's a really big persuadable middle. Where do we go with that?
So I'm gonna be really not I don't know what the word is. Provocative here.
Why stop now?
Here's the unfortunate truth that I believe is that folks who are older, who are self-identified Republicans, if they're older, they will never change their minds on this issue. I'm sorry to say that. I just think that's the case. We see it in our own polling over and over and over again. Where there is movement on the Republican side of the equation are people who are under the age of 35. Self-identified Republicans who are 18 to 24 look like Democrats on this issue, as they do on gun violence and immigration. And if the Republican Party is not careful, they will lose their status as a majority national party, and ultimately maybe even as a national party, if they don't figure out how to deal with this issue, immigration, gun violence, and a couple of others. And if they continue to be a racist party, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. But that's actually where there's going to be movement. So you don't need to speak to conservatives.
You're waiting for people to die.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I'm being very realistic about this.
Okay.
That is that's the biggest voting bloc for the Republican Party. But as soon as the younger demographic that cares about this issue starts to vote in numbers, they will move the Republican Party, and then they will move this issue forward. I hate to say that, and that's why I'm being provocative. But I also believe it's true.
We should take some questions, right?
No, we will.
Oh, I was just going to say, so I think of it like speaking to my brother-in-law, who's in Staten Island, and no surprise, a Republican. We're not sure how that marriage happened, but my sister on certain issues just doesn't say anything, and I can't help it. But so one of the things that I always try to talk about is not talk about climate, and certainly not talk about whether it's a Democratic issue or Republican issue, but really, like I was saying before, go back to the advances in technology, that we have better systems that can replace the old, right? He buys a new car every 3 or 4 years, right? This is what we're talking about. We're talking about implementing new technology that would reduce pollution also. Isn't that a great thing? Like, kids won't have asthma. And so I try to find ways to talk about it that doesn't politicize it and doesn't make it so angry, about what's in the political sphere, but more about, this is about public health, this is about the future of our children and reducing pollution. And like I shouldn't say who, because now the Trump administration is in place, but usually when you talk about children and public health, everyone kind of agrees. We want to reduce pollution, we want to protect the children, Anyway, and so that's the way that I find it. And I have to say, even when I was at EPA and trying to push environmental justice principles, you know, you fly into Oklahoma and they don't want to hear environmental justice. So we would talk about sustainability and walkability. So you just find ways that you're going to improve, you know, who was saying this? Like, we're going to build better cities, and jobs are going to come along with it, and the economy will improve. So there's other ways to talk about it that sometimes is a much nicer conversation, especially at Thanksgiving.
Now, we've still got 15 minutes, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So, great. There's time for some questions, and here's how we're going to do it. Each of you has a microphone in front of you. And if you can figure out how to turn it on, because this is being live streamed and recorded.
So the first red button is the first one.
Yep. Okay.
I see a red button back there.
Yep. And so use the button, and then on top of that,
win.
I'm asking, in my own rude way, to please make sure that you're actually asking questions, as opposed to making a statement. All right. I think you were up first.
I'm sorry, I've been dying to talk this entire conversation. Everybody has been so interesting in such many different ways. I'm extremely curious about how all the judges that are now being appointed by the Trump administration are going to alter the responses to the lawsuits that you're filing. Lisa, I was curious about that. I'm very interested in the whole idea of people being empowered by taking action. So the discussion that we've had about that, to the degree that we've had it, not so much, really more I would like, actually. But carbon tax has not been addressed at all, and I do believe that if the dividends could actually be returned to the citizens, it would engage everybody on a level that is quite similar to what Alaska engaged with oil. If we could please, all of us, on an individual, on a community, on a citizenship, on a residency, or however we want to talk about it, I would just love to hear, not from the Sierra Club who wants the money to be returned to the Sierra Club, but from those of you who have a different point of view, which would be that if every citizen actually participates in those dividends, then they would be curious, a little bit more curious than they were the day before, about climate change and how that money ended up in their pocketbook. So I would love you all to address that and see if we can't figure out how to take joint action in that direction.
Okay.
So I think many of us are worried about some of the appointments going forward. I think, as I mentioned before, what we're trying to do is really establish case law and hopefully make it strong enough that if each next case would be able to rely on precedent and a slew of cases that suggest EPA, as long as they meet this criteria or as long as they're within the statutory requirements, that EPA's can maintain or has to maintain its reliance on sound science. And so I think that's where we're coming from, is really right now at least building the precedent that would exist. I think we are worried about cases of first impression where maybe there is a little bit more wiggle room for judges to play around or to put more of their political desires or their party desires into a decision. So we are worried about that. Hopefully we're delaying enough appointments and banking on a new administration soon. But for right now, we seem to be at least dealing with things under the Administrative Procedures Act or simple, very clear stated law, case law, from past environmental cases, and that's how we're kind of winning. And hopefully that'll stick for the near future, at least.
And on the carbon tax front, despite the word tax in that phrase, there does seem to be some Republican support for and I'll use two pieces of jargon, a revenue-neutral carbon tax, meaning it doesn't actually give more money to the government, that then replaces some of our other taxes like the tax on employment or things of that nature. Now, what I would say is that people should be very careful about what they give up in order to get a carbon tax, and also need to be very careful about the design of that carbon tax to make sure that it actually achieves what you want it to, which would mean a very high carbon tax. And that might be, while I agree with you that folks who are getting a dividend check in the mail might be more intrigued, there will be some political difficulties around a high carbon tax.
So I'm going to, as John knows, so my organization actually helps. It works closely with the Climate Leadership Council and the Americans for Carbon Dividends, which is known as the Baker-Schultz plan, which is a significant carbon tax. So I can speak. It's my belief that this may be the one and only thing that can achieve bipartisan support at the national level. And on the the price has to be high enough. You need to have an environmental integrity mechanism that guarantees it continues to rise in order to get the job done. And you need to continue to allow for the American public support of it. That's why dividend is so crucial. I don't think people realize this. If there is a $2,000 dividend from a carbon tax that nearly every industry we talk to now would support. The only place that's not being supported is within Congress, among the Republican leadership. But all the industries want to do it. They're okay with it. A $2,000 check from the Social Security Administration or somewhere else looks an awful lot like Medicare or Social Security on the solution side of the equation. For half the country, that means they'll have more money in their pocket that can get them through a catastrophic event like a healthcare emergency or something else. It will make a significant dent. And everywhere a dividend has been tried, where the payment goes to people, they then support the policies, even a ratcheting up of the policies. So I argue that that's actually where we need to get to. And so, and I actually, sorry for this, I have an entire chapter in my book that talks about this and why it actually can work as a national solution. There may be other solutions, a clean energy standard nationally, some other mechanisms, but the purest, simplest, straightest way is the public supports a significant price on carbon. It's passed through. It fundamentally alters the energy system, and we get out of this problem. I mean, that in sort of in a straight line fashion. So your question is, I would say, absolutely, that's what we need. I would argue that that's what we need. I'm not saying that there aren't other arguments. I'm a big fan of regulatory power as well. I mean, I talk to the FDA and to regulate the tobacco industry after all. But I think this is such a big problem. We need a big solution to solve it.
I see the light on for Gavin Schmidt.
I'm not going to cause any trouble. So going back to your marina owner, John McCarthy, right? The fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter why his marina is sinking, right? There's nothing that he can do that's going to stop it. It's the same for people in Tangier Island. It's the same for the coastal difficulty in Miami. Like, this is, part of the things that we're not going to be able to save are the things that are already flooding on a regular basis. So, and it's not his problem necessarily to solve, right? He's not the person that needs to be persuaded that there needs to be a carbon tax or some carbon or a clean energy standard. Like, he has actually no influence on any of those decisions. So, I think when you're talking to somebody like that, you have to have, what is it you're trying to communicate? You're not trying to communicate that they need to change their lives. What are you trying to communicate? And if you don't know what it is that you're trying to communicate to that particular audience, then it's no wonder that we don't do a very good job of communicating whatever it is we thought we were trying to communicate.
In my case, I was trying to get a quote for a story, so.
You're not.
I mean, I wasn't arguing with him, but please.
Right. The people that need to be persuaded are not necessarily the people who are suffering. They're not necessarily the people who are digging themselves out of Florence, or who are digging themselves out of Harley, or who are getting nuisance flooding every other high tide. Right? They're the people who are actually making decisions at much higher levels. We shouldn't think that talking to the people that are suffering is the same conversation that talking to the people in power. So, that's just
Okay.
But he is somewhat reflective of, I believe, President Trump's views. So that would be a person who's in an extremely influential position of power. And so if you can't talk to the Jean Lafitte guy, how are you going to talk to the Donald?
The Jean Lafitte guy was really terrific, by the way. I liked him a lot. Now, there's a red light on your microphone, but you're pointing it.
Oh, I was just going to respond quickly. I think also part of the solution is making sure that those people become the next decision makers. And what's happening a lot, I mean, this goes into education and opportunities for people, but if we could actually make sure that there's equity in education and in opportunities, you would have people like my former boss, Lisa Jackson, who was from the Ninth Ward in New Orleans and made decisions differently than what we're seeing at the EPA today. And so all of us also, especially in a school, have a responsibility to make sure that we're giving those opportunities to people to become the next decision makers from all walks of life.
Well, I've heard questions about what should be the content of messaging and to whom are the messages directed. Who the messenger is matters as well for a variety of audiences. And I find thinking about climate under siege and my blood runs cold when I hear what is happening within federal agencies, the advisory council, the contamination and adulteration of that scientific resource. I remember that we have national academies of science, and their voice is not heard. At any rate, I can't hear it. Is there any way they could be cranked up to be more vocal? Are they also being adulterated and contaminated?
They are. Can I speak to that? Because I actually spent the entire day in the boardroom at the National Academy of Sciences on this very subject. And if you go to the boardroom of NAS, for those of you who haven't been there, they have a painting from when President Lincoln convened the National Academy of Sciences. And so that's how far this country has come. So that was President Lincoln. So they actually are taking this. They made a very courageous decision to create a National Climate Communications Initiative. The National Academy of Sciences did. They are working on that diligently right now. They haven't issued it yet, but they have committed themselves to doing that. So they absolutely have stepped into the breach, and they want to do that. So they have heard your unspoken voice. They want to do that, and I believe they will. So as AAAS wants to do that, AGU has made a similar decision. All the leading scientific organizations have chosen to step into the breach. I want to answer your other question as well. Every survey that ever shows, most of the American public wants to hear from experts when they diagnose or talk about a problem. They want to hear from Gavin Schmidt talk about it. They want to hear the experts talk about what they have expertise in. So scientists, even in climate science, is the highest value expert. The only community that doesn't want to hear from the experts are the Trump base. I'm just going to be provocative and blunt about it again. They dismiss facts, they dismiss evidence, they don't want to hear from the experts. Everybody else does. So who talks about this does matter. And it shouldn't always be just environmental advocates. Although I will say, if it were not for Earthjustice right now, every single one of those EPA, I mean, they're literally filing a lawsuit every 10 days. So is Sierra Club, so is NRDC. So thank goodness for Earthjustice, but sometimes as a messenger, they may not be the best messenger on this issue. So that's my answer.
And you.
My question is about environmental education and kids. It's an area I've been focused on, and I haven't heard real mention of it, but are any of you trying to reach out to our schools and our teachers' colleges so that we can have some environmentally literate teachers in the classroom? We're getting in-service teachers to go back and get their supplemental education so they're environmentally literate. Do any of you know efforts in this area?
Well,
Before we answer the question, could everybody with a microphone on turn it off between questions, because the system's getting a little overwhelmed? And so just turn them on again when the time comes. Thank you, and I'm sorry about that.
So very quickly, I'll tell you, this is a couple of real problems with teachers in schools who want to teach. I spent a lot of time on this subject when I was at the National Science Foundation. The problem is earth science teachers are the only ones who sort of generally touch on this subject in the classroom, and they don't really have a remit to do that, so they have to go out of their way to do that. So it's not, so that would be great if that changes. Second, there are lots of efforts in the textbooks and in the curriculum. There's sort of a war over climate science, just like there's a war over evolution in the textbooks. And so we need, there are efforts to try to surround that, but it's a real problem. And that is still a holdover from the climate science denial effort. So it is absolutely a problem. And the simplest, there are organizations that are fighting to that very good fight. There are a couple of trade groups that are trying to do that. They're fighting on the front lines without a whole lot of support or recognition. But it's a big fight. There are some folks who are paying very close attention to that fight.
Yeah, I think I see it more in elementary schools, probably in our kids' schools. And so it's great that they are talking. I mean, I think one of the reasons straws have been banned in so many places is because a lot of times it started with the kids and the turtle. But I will say that I just also heard of HBCU conference, the historically black colleges, starting to have annual conferences to talk to their students to become those teachers, especially when we talk about, going into communities of color that maybe aren't talking about this issue. So I'm seeing it a little bit more, but to your point, it could be a much bigger movement that we are having the scientists become the professors, become the teachers to really help with the movement.
And there are a lot of media organizations that are targeting children with this kind of educational material. Yeah. I would be remiss if I didn't mention my employer's TED Ed effort, which is producing kind of explainer animations about things like climate change.
Or the New York Times, which has a kids section and which is focused on environmental stuff. I hate to say it because y'all have got such great questions, but we just hit 8:30. We'll be here for a while if you want to come down and ask a question, but thank you very much for coming. And thank you.